Hi, my name's Jonah Nelson. I'm here with Family Tree Nursery, and today we're going to talk about some of the basic things that you need to know about owning houseplants. Now, houseplants is a kind of a funny term because we've taken plants that are from all over the world and then we've taken them and put them in our homes. So basically we've captured plants and now we're trying to make a space in our homes feel warm and inviting and beautiful with plants. But they don't always want to live in the spot that we want them to. So we have to learn how to speak the language of plants. We have to learn what they need, where they want to be, so that they can thrive and survive in our homes. Some of the most important things when you're selecting a houseplant is where you're going to put it. Now, all of our houses don't have the same direction of windows, so you really want to first figure out what way your windows face. A south-facing window or a west-facing window is typically the brightest window inside your home. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean that you have the best light inside those windows because there are some factors that you need to consider. A couple things to consider would be, do you have large shade trees in your front yard? Would that inhibit light from entering those south or west facing windows? Do you have an eave that overhangs, or do you have a front porch that inhibits light from coming in? Now, because the south and the west windows are great windows for houseplants, those are the windows that we would typically say have bright light or direct sunlight. Now, there's a lot of houseplants when you'll read about them, and plants don't read. We write about plants and we say, these are the things that these plants should do, but they don't always obey the writing that we write about them. So when we say a plant likes bright indirect light, that's going to be most houseplants. And so when we think about the things that work well in those environments, you've got a whole lot of options. Now, what is the most common thing that happens is people will say, I don't have great light inside my home. And so what we're looking at today are some of the easiest to care for houseplants, whether you have great sunlight in a west or south facing window, or if you have windows that are facing north and east, and maybe you don't get as much light in those windows. So some of my favorite options for those environments are right here on this table. My first and most favorite of all categories really are the snake plants. They're the Sansevieria plant family. And Sansevierias come in a variety of colors, shapes, and sizes. And the nice thing about Sansevierias is that they just don't require nearly as much water as many other houseplants do. So a snake plant, because they can store water not only in their root system, but in the foliage of the plant, they do really well in houses as low light plants. They also have a very low water requirement. A snake plant only needs watered about every 3 to 4 weeks, and that's about maximum. I have some that are in north-facing windows that only need watered every 8 weeks. So this is a very durable, very easy to care for houseplant. Some of my favorite varieties, like fernwood, have a really unique characteristic where they have these really long, skinny leaves, and they can really look nice. You can take it and drop it into a container, and this will grow very slowly and require very low light as well as very low water. Other varieties that are really unique, the starfish Sansevieria, is just something that is unique. Everybody feels like they have to touch it because it almost feels rubbery and fake. It's such an easy plant to grow. Some of the newer varieties like La Rubia, this is a very bright colored Sansevieria, and this one is kind of a new and improved variety that some people would say is growing in popularity as a smaller or kind of a dwarf variety. Doesn't get as big as like a Laurenti, which is one of the most common varieties. And then beyond that, one of my favorite varieties of all, this right here is the Moonshine Sansevieria. And I really love this kind of pastel light green coloration. This works awesome in containers, in homes, and is one that has a very slow grow rate, but also has very low water requirement and can handle that low light. Now, besides snake plants, because they are a little bit limiting in their structure and their architecture, there's some other things that you can use. I really like these ZZ plants. We call them the Easy ZZ because they just are such a great, durable, easy to care for houseplant. Now, they have a storage structure in the root system that looks almost like a potato. So you'll start to see them growing on the surface. But the beautiful part about that storage structure is that they require very little water. This plant, again, a ZZ plant, only needs watered about every 3 to 4 weeks, and it can certainly go longer than that. And so this is a plant, again, in a north or east window that would do great, but additionally, it can grow about anywhere in the house. So this is an awesome plant. Newer varieties like Raven ZZ have grown in popularity because it has got that dark foliage, and it's just really unique in how dark that foliage is. So we really like that. Now, those are the two easiest of all the houseplants to grow because of low water and low light requirement. But one of the most common things that people ask for are ferns. They go, I want a fern inside my house. Well, you can get yourself into real trouble using some of the ferns inside your house because they can drop a lot of foliage as the seasons change and the day length changes and they have less light. They'll shed some of their fronds. And so a Boston fern or a Kimberly queen fern that you might use outside on your patio all season long doesn't do as well inside the home in the wintertime because it can drop and make a mess. Some of my favorite ferns are things like the bird's nest ferns because they have these beautiful large leaves and they come in a variety of sizes. This is a bird's nest first, and then this is a crispy wave fern. And this little 2-inch fern is awesome for a quick drop in, like on a kitchen counter or a centerpiece on an island. And so these are so much easier than some of those other ferns because they don't have the smaller leaf texture, and so they don't drop all the fronds. These can tolerate bright indirect light. They can also handle lower light, but again, because it has this larger leaf, they don't dry out as frequently, which means they can go further between waterings. About every 2 to 3 weeks on watering on some of these ferns. In brighter light areas, they will require more water, which could be every 7 to 10 days in a brighter environment. So there's some of the ferns. Another fern that's durable and does an awesome job inside the home is the staghorn fern. Now the staghorn fern can be mounted on a cedar plank, or you can grow this in a container. I love staghorn ferns. They love the humidity outdoors, so you can move this plant outside in the summertime on a shaded patio or on a deck, and they'll continue to grow and multiply, and they'll grow from that base where they just thicken up and really develop great structure, and it adds a really nice architectural and foliage interest to your indoor houseplants. Now, besides some of those easiest to care for houseplants, some of my favorite things are some of the cactus. This here is a type of prickly pear, and this is a variegated variety. And I use these all over my house and I have a really fun time with this too because my kids like to propagate it. So it's an easy plant to propagate by removing one petal. You can let it callus for about a week and then take it and transplant it into a new pot, and you can start a new plant very easily from one prickly pear cactus. So this is a cool plant because it is so drought tolerant. I mean, this can handle a lot of neglect. And so this plant going inside, you can water it every 2 months and it would be just absolutely fine. Now they do prefer bright light, so the brighter the window, the better they'll do. However, they can move further into the home as well and have that bright indirect light. They just won't reproduce and grow new petals quite as quickly. So the prickly pear cactus, super durable. Other thing I like about this one is it's a thornless cactus, so you're not getting poked by what a prickly pear would normally do to you. This is just a great, easy to care for plant that, again, I think adds some incredible structure and some really fun foliage texture to a room. Another type of plants that are incredibly popular are the philodendrons or the pothos, and there's some terminology that people will get into about what the right name is. And so the pothos, that we like to call them, are a really, really good, quick-growing indoor house plant. It's probably one of the go-tos for somebody who wants a plant that's going to be trailing or cascading, maybe on a bookshelf or on an end table. These work really well. The marble queen is one of my favorites because it has that white and green splotching that gives that variegation, just a pop of color. And the marble queen will continue to grow all year long. This is not a plant that really stops growing. So it's a plant also for people who like control and they want to get things on a schedule. You can get this plant on a schedule and you can water it every 7 to 10 days with most certainty. Now, there are instances where you might need to water more frequently or less frequently, depending on the light level, but it's a pretty easy plant to get on a schedule as long as you've got good soil and good drainage. So the marble queen. The jade pothos is the tried and true, just that green, beautiful foliage is a very good variety. These are super easy to propagate also. As they vine out, you can take cuttings, you can root them directly in water, or you can root them into a soil. And they work really well for, again, propagating and adding more plants to the home. As they mature and as they age, as they grow longer vines, sometimes the center will thin out on a pothos. And the reason it thins out is because it's putting energy towards the tips of the new growth. And oftentimes when I hear that somebody's plant is thinning out on the interior, but it's still continuing to grow, oftentimes that means that it's actually needing repotted because it doesn't have enough soil volume to continue to grow good roots. And so it's really needing nutrition, it's needing more room. And what you can do is you can take cuttings off the tip, you can root them and then plant them back into the center to develop a thicker internal base to the pothos once again. And so these are great plants and are so easy to grow. Bright indirect light is what you're going to hear, again, putting a pothos in a room. However, you can use them also in lower lit areas. They work incredibly well. Besides some of these that are some of the easiest plants to grow, there are some key things that you need to know in order to be successful growing these. One of the most important things that we run into is, when should I repot my tropicals? What is the right time of year to put them into a new container? And how do I know when it needs repotted? There's a couple signs that will tell you that a plant needs repotted. Number one, you could start seeing yellow leaves or thinning leaves, especially if it's been on a regular routine of you watering it, and all of a sudden it starts to thin out on the interior. Some of those interior leaf dropping can be from the day length change, but they can also be from an overwatering or underwatering, but it can also be because the plant is running out of room in its container, and so it might be time to repot it. The best time of year to repot most of your houseplants is going to be in the spring and the summer. The reason being is the day length has changed to where it's getting longer days, and so the plants are actively growing. Replanting a tropical plant when the day length is lengthened and the plant is actively growing will only benefit it in getting rooted and established quicker, which can ultimately limit the amount of transplant shock it has. When a plant gets transplanted, they inevitably will go through some transplant shock. It's actually not a bad thing, because when you disturb the root systems of a plant, they actually regenerate and regrow roots quite quickly. Well, and it depends on the variety. But some of these things, and I'll just show you real quick. This is the cactus in a 6-inch container or a gallon container, and you take it out, and the roots are really wrapped around the entire container. So if I was going to replant this right now, I would actually ruffle up the roots and then take it and tuck it into a container. How big of a container? I would not take this 6-inch container and put it into a 10-inch pot. That would be a little bit too big for a cactus. But taking it into something like this, like a 7-inch container or an 8-inch container, would make perfect sense. You want to go up just a couple inches larger than the diameter of the container that you currently have it in. When you repot it, it's important that you make sure that your container has a drain hole. Now, not all pottery has a drain hole. And so when you get a pot and you're saying, I need to water my plant, you want to water a plant so that water runs through the bottom of the pot and it drains out, so that you don't run into the problem of waterlogging or overwatering the plant. So some really beautiful containers, like this one here, has no drain hole. And so what we will do in order to get a drain hole in this is drill it. There's two different bits you can use. You can use a masonry bit or a hole saw diamond tip blade. And I always will recommend using the hole saw diamond tip blade because it drills through pottery so much easier. This works really well on ceramics and on porcelain, where your masonry bit would work better on something like a concrete. But these are both really important to have on hand, or come to the garden center and we can drill a hole for you and we can help get a hole in that container. When you water plants that are freshly transplanted, and that is important when you transplant your plants, to make sure that you water them in to settle the soil in all around them, you want to make sure that that water is running through the bottom of the pot. We talk to people all the time about how much do I water when I water. Well, ideally, when you water, you want to mimic rainfall. You want to mimic what's going on outside. And so when you water your plant, you should water it all the way through until you get runoff. And what we like to call that is container capacity. You want to reach container capacity when you water. When you water, water should be running through the bottom of the pot. Well, that being said, water running through the bottom of the pot doesn't mean that the plant is all the way watered. As a plant dries out and as it matures, the roots will actually pull the soil away from the edge of the pot that it's in, meaning the water will run around the outside of the root ball and run right down around that ceramic pot or the pot that you have in your home. And so water can run out the bottom of a pot very quickly. That doesn't mean that it's watered all the way. So there are instances where you actually will need to water 2 and 3 times. The best way to water is to take the plant to the sink or to a shower, or to have it somewhere where water can run all the way out through the bottom of the container to ensure that you've reached container capacity. Our plants really want to go through wet cycles and dry cycles, and that is ultimately what creates a plant's growth. Getting them wet, then getting them dry. This back and forth triggers the plant to continue to grow and search for more water, which ultimately beautifies your home because it adds more foliage and more character to your plants as they grow. Now, when you transplant your plants into new containers and you have moved them out of their existing pot, you are inevitably going to find that some plants will drop some foliage. It's very common and very normal. The thing that can cause more harm to a plant is in those moments when we respond and think that we need to water more. And that's the most common reaction. We get yellow leaves, water more. That'll solve it. That'll fix the plant from having any more yellow leaves. But that's a very slippery slope. If you take a plant and you're going from a smaller 6-inch pot up to an 8-inch pot, and the roots really aren't out into that new soil yet, that new soil can stay incredibly saturated and wet. And so you don't want to respond by watering a plant that is already wet. If a plant is wet or damp, then you need to skip watering it. Watering is one of the biggest causes for death of a plant inside of a home. It's too much or too little. And that's the really hard thing about understanding and knowing the language of plants. How do I know if my plant needs water? Well, the best way to find out if your plant needs water, believe it or not, is not a moisture meter. You can use a moisture meter, and this is a really good idea and a way to teach yourself of what is wet and what is dry. But really the best way to understand what is wet and what is dry is to feel the soil with your hand. You can feel it. If you feel it damp or wet, that is your key. Do not water it. It needs to dry to feel dry in between those watering cycles. Using the moisture meter, it can help guide you in that, but you really shouldn't rely on it. This moisture meter is only going to reach down about 6 to 8 inches into this container. If you have a larger plant that's a 10-inch pot or greater, this won't tell you what's going on all the way at the bottom of the pot, which means you could have a lot of water sitting in the bottom of the pot and the top quarter inch or inch feels really dry to you. And so this is where you can't rely on an instrument in and of itself. As you continue to grow your plant, you will learn the language of the plant by understanding some of the signs and some of the symptoms of what it means to be dry. When you're thinking about watering your plant, you always want to err a little bit on the side of dry than on the side of too wet. I explain it to people like this. You can go and get dehydrated every day and you can get rehydrated. And so it's a really good reminder that you can always get rehydrated. You can do the same with your plant. But I only drowned once, and it's really hard to recover a plant that's drowning. When you start to develop root rot in the container and the roots start to die back because they've rotted out, it's really hard. You want to take the plant out of the pot at that point, remove the soil, and get any of that rot out so that it doesn't continue to grow inside your root system. It is very important to run your plants on the drier side than on the wetter side. Now, there's a lot of options and a lot of different ways that you can pot up your plants. I must recommend a professional grade potting soil. There's a lot of different types of potting soils that are out there, and there's different potting soils for different types of plants. And I would always recommend an orchid bark mix for an orchid. But for most other houseplants, and not all of them, but most other houseplants, a professional grade potting soil is the way to go. You don't want to use composting inside your home because that can smell really bad, and it's not the right type of soil that you'd want to plant your pots in. Things like our professional grade potting mix work really, really well. This has peat moss, perlite, and a little bit of bark in it. Things that you want to avoid are things that say holds moisture or moisture holding crystals or things that have a preloaded fertilizer in it. You want to use things that are kind of the basics type so that you are more in control of what you apply to your houseplants. Now, houseplants, just like us, they like to eat. And so when do I fertilize my houseplants? I've selected the right houseplant. I've got them potted into the right pot, but when and how much do I fertilize with? And I try to tell people that it's really easy in the Midwest to follow the season changes as your time of year to fertilize your houseplants. When the trees have leaves on them out in your yard and in landscapes, that's the time of year you should fertilize. When the trees drop their leaves in the fall, all the way through the winter, that's the time of year where you can stop fertilizing your houseplants. So if you can follow that generalized seasonal change as your key time to fertilize and to turn the fertilizing off, it is the easiest way to get your plants on a really healthy schedule. Now, houseplants inside the home, we've talked mostly about smaller things, but houseplants in the home, you might want something bigger in the corners of your room. And I really like doing plants in pots as a drop-in. Some of the larger tropical plants and houseplants really are hard to move. And so things like this bird of paradise here, I've used just to drop it down inside of a container, and it can grow in that grow pot for at least a season or so. Now, when I'm using a grow pot and dropping it in, there's a couple key things that you have to be ready for. I'll use something like a deep saucer, where the deep saucer can sit down inside of the container so that you don't have water on your floor. As an added insurance policy, I will always use a cork mat underneath that container to, number one, protect the floor, but also to make sure if any water did spill out while I was watering, then it will keep the floor from getting damaged. Tabletop house plants, we have smaller cork mats, and those cork mats can again protect surfaces like wood tables. And this is a really good approach to use because you can have humidity that builds up underneath the container, even if it's sitting on the countertop that's been watered and then let it drip dry. This is just a very good way to protect paint surfaces like on a windowsill or a tabletop that you don't want to get damaged. We oftentimes have plants that we want in specific spots in our home, but those plants don't always work in the spots that we want them. And so selecting the plant for your home, the right plant for your home, is really important. Some things that people want instantly would be height. They want to add height to a room or to an area in the room, and that can be challenging. So selecting a piece of pottery that might be taller and then using that method of dropping the plants into the pot works really, really well. I really like this Dracaena right here. This is a very slow growing Dracaena called Janet Craig compacta, and it's one of my go-to low light houseplants, but it's also a plant that can give you really good vertical height. Now right now, sitting on the ground, it's about 5 foot tall. But I've got a taller pot here at about 3 foot tall, and you can set that plant up and you can get a plant in your home over 6 or 7 foot by using a vertical pot and then staging the plant and raising it up to a higher elevation. These are really great durable plants, and it's a plant that I would recommend to somebody if they're wanting something that gets higher or taller inside their home. Some plants that are really challenging and I would recommend maybe a first-time plant owner shouldn't try would be a fiddle-leaf fig. It's not the easiest plant. We have fiddle-leaf figs, and they're a beautiful plant, but I would say start with a bird of paradise or start with a Dracaena. See how that goes for you before you make that investment of adding a fiddle-leaf fig to your home. We have a ton of houseplants at Family Tree Nursery. We have a great selection at all of our stores. You can get any of these products at our store, and we would love to see you at Family Tree Nursery anytime you're in the area. You can visit us at familytreenursery.com. You can check us out on Instagram and Facebook, and we look forward to seeing you soon at Family Tree Nursery.